Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for our web conference, Risk Management Part 2, sponsored by BROWZ and hosted by Supply and Demand Chain Executive Magazine. To listen to Part 1, The Risks of Globalization, please visit our website, www.sdcexec.com. I'm Barry Hochfelder, editor of Supply and Demand Chain Executive Magazine. Our mission is to provide intelligence and decision-making information for executives and management professionals as they enable their supply and demand chains for competitive advantage. And it's our pleasure as part of that mission to present today's web conference. This will be an interactive conversation with our panelists, and we'll take some of your questions during the event as well as at the end, so be sure to enter them in the question box area on your screen. Our sponsor, Salt Lake City-based BROWZ, has provided supplier qualification and management solutions since 2001. The company serves more than 17 industries, including many Fortune 50 brands. BROWZ has the expertise to provide supplier qualification and management, clearly an important element of supply chain strategy. And now, let me introduce our panelists. Brett Armstrong is Vice President at BROWZ. He has more than a decade of experience in supplier qualification and contractor management and has supported the world's leading organizations during the implementation and ongoing management of supply chain qualification programs. He's documented key activities that ensure success and can help jumpstart contractor qualification programs, whether in-house or with a third-party provider. Our next panelist, Laura Cecere, is founder and CEO of Supply Chain Insights, which is devoted to thought-leading supply chain research. Laura has 30 years of diverse supply chain experience as an analyst, supply chain software specialist, and practitioner. Her book, Bricks Matter, was published in December 2012. She also is the author of the enterprise software blog, Supply Chain Shaman. The blog focuses on the use of enterprise applications to drive supply chain excellence. She's a member of the Supply and Demand Chain Executive Editorial Advisory Board. And finally, I'd like to welcome our third panelist, Rory King, Corporate Director of IHS Incorporated, a leading provider of insight and analytics to business and governments in more than 150 countries around the world. Rory has over 15 years of supply chain experience in research and analysis, consulting, sales, marketing, and thought leadership positions. He's a regular contributor to Supply and Demand Chain Executive Magazine and winner of several of our distinguished Pros to Know and Green Supply Chain Awards. As I noted earlier, we want this to be an interactive forum, so please submit any questions you have by using the question box area on your screen, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. Any we can't get to during the event will be answered by email. And please note we'll have an archived version of this seminar posted on the Supply and Demand Chain Executive website, www.sdcexec.com, and you should see all the slides from the seminar on that version. I'll repeat the URL for you later. And now, let's get going. I usually like to start these roundtables with this question for our panelists. I'm sure their answers will ring true for most, if not all, of our listeners. What do your clients and customers say keeps them up at night when you talk to them about risk? And does that, in turn, keep you up? Let's start with Brett Armstrong. Brett?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. You know, great question, and I think it might be easier to say what doesn't keep risk managers up at night. There's so much when you think about risk management, such a broad topic. Certainly there's the traditional concerns with corporate governance, regulatory and operational risk, business continuity. But we're seeing some significant changes with the clients that we work with. There really seems to be a growing awareness of the hidden risks that are specific to indirect spend and the hiring of contractors. I think many organizations have probably underestimated what that risk looks like and what it could amount to in the event that there was some type of risk-related event. When you think about it, every time a contractor sets foot on your property, they're introducing some level of risk to the business, and mitigating that risk really requires the buy-in from multiple departments. And that's where BROWZ has found our niche, is really helping to mitigate the risk in the hiring process of contractors and suppliers on the indirect side. As a part of that, in recognizing this type of risk, we've had to step back and really work with our clientele to understand what challenges they face from a standpoint of documenting the risk within their supply chain. So we're looking at everything from financial stability to insurance coverage, safety, and corporate social responsibility. In most cases, we found that this process really begins on the procurement side, but it's not limited to procurement when you talk about qualification and vetting of contractors. So one of the things that we're consistently hearing relates to a changing landscape in procurement. Historically, their primary function was aimed at cost reduction. In terms of the changing landscape, today procurement's being asked to expand beyond cost reduction, and they're being asked to do everything with fewer resources. And they're certainly driving this process that we're involved with. So you've got risk management, who is trying to engage a number of departments to identify the risk early on that may be presented to a business as a result of hiring a contractor. And then you've got procurement, who is trying to maintain a focus of cost reduction without compromising quality or introducing unnecessary risk to the business, assessing supplier and contractor business continuity, but now also being asked to partner with other departments to look at standards that may identify potential risk of hiring a given contractor or supplier. So those are the types of challenges that we're hearing today, from risk managers and procurement, really uncovering the hidden risks of their supply chain and getting through partnership from a number of departments internally so that they can come together to identify and mitigate risk early on in the hiring process.
Okay, great. And excuse me, thanks, Brett. Laura, how about you and your clients? What are you hearing about their risk issues?
So a little different take. I'm hearing about the management of global operations as we've had more gray hairs like myself retire. We have people walking out the door with really tribal knowledge about the supply chain, and a changing of the guard of first and second generation pioneers retiring, and a mid-management talent gap. The other thing that I hear a lot about is that we've made our product lines more complex, and as we've done that, forecastability, or the ability to forecast products, has increased, and so one of the risks is greater inventory write-offs or the ability to manage operations in that time. Third thing that I hear is the fragility of the supplier base. Never in my studies of supply chain management have I ever seen a more fragile supply base. We learned in the recession from the automotive industry about how to kill the supply base with, continually focusing on cost and pushing payables back on the supply chain. And more mature companies have adopted very strong supplier development programs. However, many companies still struggle, and as a result, they have a fragile supply base, and one where companies are in pretty dire financial straits. So those are some of the risks that I hear about that are more day-to-day operational risk. I hope that helps.
Okay, great, absolutely. Rory, how about you? I know IHS is so diverse that you must have, risk stories coming at you all the time.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Picking up actually off of Brett and Laura's comments, it's interesting because it reminds me of a study that, two studies in fact, that we had done, one with Supply and Demand Chain Executive on the topic of risk last year, and then one just an organic piece of research that IHS did. But I actually just happened to pull those up as we were talking about it, and I happened to notice that it's interesting that the top concerns cited in both of those studies included supplier viability or failure, including safety and risk of safety issues with suppliers. Another one that's top in both of those, the second most cited risk was around global economics, currency fluctuations, and geopolitical interruptions. And I'll talk about that in a second. That's something that's really, if I were to offer an IHS perspective on an area that we see people looking at in terms of what's keeping them up at night and where they're taking actions, it's around geopolitical and economic turbulence. But, you know, for what it's worth, I'll point out it's interesting to hear Laura's comments, because two of the other and potentially to some folks maybe surprising results is that the availability or scarcity of talent was on that list, and so was predicting demand in terms of the top quote-unquote supply chain risks to organizations. And that was a survey body of about 1,000 practitioners and executives. So certainly the issues that Laura and Brett have spoken to are among the top 5, top 10 list in terms of a large list of risks that we looked at. From an IHS perspective, I'll just offer probably the 3 largest trends that we see in terms of what's keeping people up at night, and then subsequently what they're turning to IHS to see if we have some insights to help them out. As number 1 is the energy price collapse. Second would be more broadly commodities as a whole, and then thirdly geopolitical and economic disturbances, like I mentioned earlier. So in terms of energy pricing, I mean, you know, we can't ignore the fact that you know, this is an era or time of great turbulence and transition for energy. You know, obviously led by the rapid oil price collapse, energy issues are really a key issue in the supply chain because of, frankly, the pervasiveness, everything from producer revenues and operating profitability to subsequently then the ability for companies to continue to operate. We actually see relative to suppliers and contractor risk that Brett mentioned, you know, this is a time where, you know, great duress or great change requires great leadership. We see risks trickling in where, you know, in the field, there's large workforces where those workforces are being slashed in large numbers. You know, people are taking on more. Laura alluded to the brain drain of senior technical talent that are, you know, voluntarily taking some of those packages or subject to this disruption. So, you know, in that way, we actually see kind of a convergence around the issues that Laura and Brett mentioned relative to the energy price issues. So certainly just energy as a whole is of concern to our customers. Beyond energy is the commodities, groups of commodities as a whole, chemicals, metals, labor, and so forth. So it wasn't just the oil prices that declined significantly, but so did non-oil commodities dropping 25 to 30% as well. So those, you know, are underlying raw materials and other aspects that are key building blocks of the supply chain that impact things like price and lead time and continuity and so forth. And then third, you know, it's just the geopolitical and economic disruptions, you know, are maybe an original or unique thing that IHS sees a lot. So everything from the impact of issues like the West Coast dock strikes and bad weather impacting GDP and implications of that in the United States to issues of war, terror, unrest, political violence in areas as close to home as Mexico, or issues in the Ukraine, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, you know, the list goes on. That's starting to impact, you know, trade flows, trade routes, shipping, safety and security, which are among the list of things that our customers are saying are keeping them up at night in terms of supply chain risk and continuity.
Great. Okay. Yeah, that's great answers, guys. I'd like to leave a question in from our audience right now. Laura, I know you had talked about the talent crisis and talent management issue, which, you know, we could do another whole program on. But this question came in and asking about lack of experience and strong middle-level management. You attend these sites, a 10-state forum that had a quote referring to the incompetency of the middle-level management now. Are you guys seeing some of that with, you know, the clear talent crisis we have with 4 generations in the workforce and the senior type folks who have all the institutional knowledge leaving? How are you replacing them? So could you maybe, Laura, why don't you maybe start first on that one, and if Brett and Rory want to chime in afterwards, that would be great.
So, as we look at the mid-management talent crisis, what's happened is we can get talent out of schools in most of the geographies around the world, less so in South America and Africa and China, but we can recruit in some of the North American and European schools to be able to have students from those countries to return. So getting graduates into the workforce is not the issue. The issue is that we have retired or offered packages or seen people leave the workforce in that 50-plus age group who have filled director, senior manager, vice president roles that have to be filled, which is pulling the organization. And as we pull, we have two cents in the ranks for mid-management. And so the question is, how do we help mature the experiences of mid-management supply chain professionals faster? And that's happening through specialized programs, the Intel Masters program, the J&J Gold program, where people are encouraged to have cross-functional experiences, mentoring programs, and some partnership with education, the MIT program, the Penn State program. But the question is, how do we fill the open holes with, it's really the jobs that would have normally have been filled by people with 5 to 6 years experience is where we're seeing that talent gap. The other thing we're seeing is a talent gap in jobs that are at the inflection point of analytics, new technologies, and new processes. So we aren't seeing it as much in supply chain execution as we're seeing it in supply chain planning and analytics. And so what's happening in those jobs is they're remaining open for 9 to 10 months, and the salaries are increasing. We have the highest salaries in supply chain planning and high tech, and we have substantially lower salaries in the process-based industries. But what we're starting to see is a rise in salaries as people want to retain employees in the planning and deeply technical and analytics jobs, and also the need to grow people into those jobs. Barry, do those thoughts help?
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. Brett or Rory, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I might add a quick comment, really just some food for thought to support what Laura was saying. So give this some thought. I know that the big crew change, as it were, is something that the energy space is really interested in, which is this large departure of the senior workforce. So for instance, so here's just an interesting statistic that Laura's comments reminded me of, that 50% of the engineering workforce is actually eligible for retirement in the next few years. I believe that was 3 to 5 years, and that was taken from the U.S. Bureau of Statistics a few years ago. And then it takes, separately, an oil and gas study done in 2012 concluded that it takes 8.2 years for a new technical field engineer to gain the sufficient experience to make non-standard or original technical decisions. So it really just speaks to, Laura mentioned the pulling on the workforce, and that's a really, to me, kind of a telling contrast where, half the senior talent is exiting the workforce or eligible to exit the workforce, and then separately it takes 8.2 years for new entrants to the workforce to start making just original contributions. So I thought that was interesting, and like I say, from an energy perspective, it couldn't come potentially at a worse time where there's lots of just workforce gyrations and demands on operating continuity and safety in the workforce.
Okay, great. Thank you. As we were putting this program together, we realized supply chain risk management is really a broad topic, which is why we've scheduled 3 of these web seminars this year. So let me ask the panelists. We'll start with Brett. What's the one area that you believe is overlooked when considering risk mitigation?
Yeah, I'll speak to it again from the standpoint of the pre-qualification process of the supply chain. One of the things that we feel like is really overlooked is the ongoing management and and maintenance of that process. Internally, we talk about compliance is more than a one-time event. And when you consider the types of information that is being collected at the time of pre-qualification of a supply chain member, the majority of that information is really very dynamic. It's never going to be static, especially when you consider licensure or insurance or historical safety statistics. Unfortunately, too often, what we hear is that a supply chain member is pre-qualified, the information is collected, and it's filed away in a filing cabinet and forgotten about. I think many organizations are starting to recognize a need to stay on top of that information to make sure that they have processes in place whereby they can actively manage that. One of the real horror stories that we hear is too often somebody is hired, they provide all the information that's been requested by the hiring organization, and within 30 days, to save a little bit of money, they cancel an insurance policy. And at that point, the organization is really left holding the bag with no way to manage or to actively monitor that information. And so for us, that's certainly one area where we feel like the risk mitigation process is being overlooked, just being able to continually stay on top of the information that they collect up front.
Okay, good. Rory or Laura, anything to add to that?
Well, I think in terms of contracted workers, security clearances are a big issue for a number of industries that are feeding into the Department of Defense and workforce issues. The other thing that we're seeing is about 10% of products today are counterfeit. And it's a major risk issue, and talent and IP protection with indirect materials and also relationships with suppliers and contract employees, are part of that intellectual property protection. But as we think about designing the supply chain so it's safe and secure and counterfeit-free, employees are definitely a place to look. So those are my thoughts. I hope they help.
Okay. Counterfeit was mentioned. Rory, I know you and I did a webinar a couple of years ago on that issue and just how serious it is. If you remember, we were even talking about Department of Defense and some of those, the stringent regulations they had started to add to those. So has there been maybe any mitigation of that, or is it still just top of mind for most folks?
Yeah, I think, well, actually, maybe in the spirit of the original question about, areas that are maybe overlooked, what I think, and certainly all the great work that we did with you in the magazine hopefully helped, but I think that the good news is that organizations are now very aware of the issue. They have taken actions. A lot of those were spurred on the Department of Defense, the NDAA of 2012, requiring actions to be taken in a number of places in the supply chain. So yes, we're seeing people actually took action and people are very aware of it, and those efforts are certainly helping. Obviously, it's a very complicated issue, especially when you get into things like cloning of technology and so forth. So the issue still remains to be a very serious supply chain risk, but I do think, people are making some positive steps in that area. Along the lines of the question around, maybe an overlooked area, I do think one thing that's overlooked, or an area that we see people trying to get their arms around, is originally I was going to say related to upstream visibility to, I mentioned earlier, geopolitics and economics and country intelligence around the origin of goods or just the location of assets, in the supply chain and where they're located, whether they're your assets or further upstream, your suppliers or their suppliers. I think what's overlooked is the availability of very good economic, country or geopolitical risk intelligence that can be combined with a lot of folks obviously have supply chain maps, network designs, transportation networks. So the combination of, that country intelligence and risk intelligence combined with supply chain from a geolocational perspective is something that I see overlooked potentially as a solution to some of the issues of risk and security in the supply chain. And I'll just say they seem like different topics, but the topics of food recalls, food sustainability, ethical supplier treatment, ethical sourcing practices, safety, things like the Bangladesh building collapse, a lot of visibility, whether that's from a social responsibility standpoint or ethical sourcing standpoint, and issues of things like conflict minerals and the presence of conflict minerals in the supply chain, or the authenticity of electronic components. All of those generally fall into the category of tracing goods in the supply chain, potentially all the way back to the country of origin, and then the authenticity and the chain of custody of goods in the supply chain. So I think we certainly see it this way, but potentially more folks will start to be seeing those as part of a common umbrella, as opposed to very just distinct and incompatible topics. They're actually there's a lot of similarities in how organizations could look at them holistically and get a better understanding of traceability in their supply chain.
Good. Before we move on, let me just remind our listeners that please ask your questions in the Q&A section of your browser, and we'll be happy to tackle them for you. All right, since we have all of this acknowledged risk in the supply chain, in regards to supplier qualification, among others, what are organizations doing to mitigate all of this, whether they're internal processes, third-party qualification, and so on? So, Brett, you want to hit it first?
Yeah, you bet. Really, I think what they're doing is they're being forced to reassess the way they do business. Rory touched on conflict minerals with the demands related to that, and when you think about the qualification process, is that being included? How is that being managed? I think one of the things that is really key when you talk about the qualification of a supply chain is making sure that you have the appropriate systems in place to do that. Again, given the dynamic nature of the qualification process, making sure that there's technology there to support that. I think that they're asking the question today, what do we currently collect and validate when it comes to supplier qualification? What should we be collecting, and are we monitoring data that is really going to mitigate the risk within our business? It goes back to the old adage that you can't manage what you can't measure. And more importantly, you need to be able to clearly articulate exactly where your supply chain stands specific to your corporate standards. So I think those are all considerations when you think about risk within the supply chain and qualifying members before they're awarded work.
Okay. Good. Rory or Laura, anything?
Well, I think that supply chains are at different levels of sophistication around supplier qualification, supplier development. I think that the traditional procurement organization was about saving money and pushing payables back on the supply base. And we've not done a good job of good information sharing with the supply base. We're still not able to give accurate forecasts or to be able to give synchronized signals despite 3 decades of IT investment. And so companies that are more mature in supply chain do a much better job around supplier development, fair labor, being able to track, whether it's conflict minerals or to be able to look at corporate social responsibility. But in our research, we've done a 3-year tracking study of corporate social responsibility, and we find that there's a pretty major risk. Over 90% of companies have a corporate social responsibility document. 70% of companies will make a marketing claim like, fair labor or, recycled products. But only 20% of companies are really looking at owning their entire value network to be able to monitor and track the sustainability inputs of carbon, energy, water, labor. And most have only automated the enterprise, and 65% of non-renewable resources are typically outside of the enterprise. And so as we think about the automation of the value chain and the automation of suppliers, we've got to really think beyond Excel data sharing on spreadsheets and email and think about the automation of value networks. And one of the risks to the organization is because of the rising IT cost of automating the supply chain in the enterprise, we're not able to get to automation of the value network to be able to truly have safe and secure and sustainable supply chains. And this is because the APS and ERP systems that we bought in the 1990s and the last decade have basically ended up taking such a large proportion of IT costs that people are struggling to invest in value network systems. I hope that helps, Barry.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And sure, listeners are appreciating all this great information they're getting. As an aside, I've been to a few risk management conferences and seminars, and it's really remarkable how the speaker will say, okay, how many of you know have risk issues in your business? All the hands will go up. How many of you are confident that you're ready for that and have a good plan in place? All the hands come down. So it's still clearly an issue out there and a problem that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, and you sort of get serious about it when something major happens, like a major recall or a supplier failure or perhaps an environmental event. But we don't really put our money where our mouth is when it comes to risk management and safe and secure and corporate social responsibility. And most executives don't understand supply chain well enough in terms of, management of this complex system to understand that it's a risk issue.
Great. Okay, good. Throughout the qualification process, Brett, let's talk a little bit more about maybe more specific on documentation that needs to be reviewed and whether there's validation of the data that's being acquired.
Yeah, when you really think about the risk management process, and this is something that's very true, we're finding that real comprehensive risk management extends beyond any single department. Multiple departments becoming involved. If we talk about common qualification assessments or standards that our clients are asking for, these assessments include things like corporate social responsibility, sustainability that's already been mentioned, quality systems, financial stability. How do you know that a member of the supply chain is going to be around 30 days from now once the contract has been awarded? Things like around supplier diversity, legal, business continuity, then a couple of the more traditional requirements being specific to environmental health and safety, taking a look at the trends of the last 4 years' historical safety statistics. Is there any indicator there that would indicate that there's some potential risk in working with a member of the supply chain? And specific to the validation question, if you're not validating the data where possible against third-party databases, you're really opening yourself up. There are a number of databases that this information can be validated against. And if you're talking about insurance, one of the things we really recommend is being included as a certificate holder on the insurance policy so that if there is ever a change in the policy limits, you'll be notified. That's one of the things that I've found to be most critical in this process is making sure that information exists and that it truly matches the need of your organization.
Okay, good. Rory or Laura, anything here to add?
Maybe just a quick comment, really to use another example of what I mentioned earlier. It's interesting that Brett brought up a lot of dimensions of risk around financial viability and insurance and other related things that people are looking at their suppliers in terms of their overall risk picture. What's interesting, a trend that we're seeing is that IHS has historically always provided country and credit risk analysts with macroeconomic data, country and sovereign risk data, and daily intelligence of today it's over 200 countries worldwide. Just to reinforce what I was saying earlier, what we're now seeing supply chain practitioners or people in that supplier qualification process looking at that same information in terms of evaluating suppliers and evaluating their supply chain risk. So looking at it the same way that a credit risk analyst might look at the country, and then there are some more specific flavors of risk. For instance, I mentioned earlier, looking at war, terrorism, civil unrest, political violence on a location-specific basis in terms of assets or operations or suppliers in your supply chain network. That's a trend that we're seeing anyhow. So I just wanted to kind of, use that to reinforce a trend that we're seeing, that, the way that people are, looking at risk in different ways are somewhat converging with the availability of information today.
Okay, good. Let's move on to another audience question here before we get back to ours. In practice, each function has its own list of risks. Can you talk about reaching a single corporate list? How best is this achieved? And I would add, is it even possible?
Barry, I'll touch on that just from what we see with our clientele. Really what it comes down to is you've got to have somebody who is willing to stick their neck out there and be responsible for getting those parties together. You really need a sponsor in this process. When we're talking about the solutions that we create, I mentioned this before, modern qualification is no longer about or no longer involves just a single department. We're seeing 5, 6 different departments becoming involved in the qualification process, and that includes the executive team. As more and more concern is placed around potential impact to the brand related to the sourcing of third-party contractors, they're very much involved in that process, and they want to make sure that the organizations are buttoned up. When we go around the table, procurement is certainly one of the champions that first introduced BROWZ to an organization. But then you've got safety. They come into these discussions. They're interested in both leading and lagging indicators, looking at historical safety stats. You've got operations that is interested in real-time access to the data. Anybody who comes on site, they want to make sure that they're only being granted access if they're in uniformity with the corporate standards. And then, certainly, procurement is interested in a simplified sourcing process and having access to critical information up front. So is it possible to come up with a single list of criteria for an entire organization? I think it's possible to support one another if you've developed a process that takes into account each department's needs. But first, you've got to have somebody who's willing to organize those discussions and bring everyone together to have some open dialogue.
Does this typically fall on procurement, or when it does happen, or are there other departments that might be able to handle it as well?
Well, I'll say this. Specific to our business, we're typically introduced by one of 2 departments, and it's typically either procurement or safety. But again, early on, it would just be the one department, but we see multiple departments being pulled into the process once they have an understanding of what they're trying to achieve. So to answer your question, yes, procurement is very often involved in this process.
Okay. And now, when these types of programs are developed in-house, are there any particular challenges that they'll commonly face that are sort of typical to trying to develop the supplier qualification program?
Yeah, I think there are a number of challenges that organizations face. I think I mentioned earlier that oftentimes, we're still running into large enterprise organizations that are operating off of spreadsheets and filing cabinets. As we talk more about that dynamic nature of the data, it becomes very difficult to manage that without some type of sophisticated software in place to monitor that information. And then I think the other thing that for consideration needs to be given is just the types of resources that they have available. We've done some studies, and it's been our finding that you really need one full-time employee for every 200 to 300 contractors or suppliers to accurately qualify and manage that information over the period of a year. And so, I think it's critical that organizations are realistic about what they can accomplish. And then, the third component to that would really be making sure that you've got buy-in high up in the organization, making sure that you have a common vision and that all interested parties are on the same page.
Right. So really, it comes back to that old change management issue. If you don't have that, and have it accepted, you've got problems.
Absolutely.
Good. And let's kind of look at the other side of it now. Since this is, we've kind of established that this is an area of supply chain risk mitigation, maybe that's, if not ignored, it certainly doesn't get the full effect. So how do the contractors react when someone actually implements a program like this? What have you seen, Brett, that in dealing with your customers?
Yeah, I think it comes back to what you said, specific to change management. Anytime you're introducing a new process, there are going to be questions. Many of these contractors are used to doing business based on a handshake. Really not having to go through a formal qualification process. So there will certainly be challenges. I think it comes down to communication, making sure that everyone, both internally and external to the hiring organization, understands the purpose behind it, what you're trying to accomplish, and the whys. But I'll be honest, for many contractors, especially those that you want to do business with, those that have invested in the insurance, the premiums that you've requested, those that have invested in safety, those organizations, they typically appreciate these types of programs because it recognizes them for their efforts and their willingness to conform to your standards. So from that standpoint, I think it really helps to attract the types of organizations that you want to do business with.
Okay. And kind of weeds out the less than stellar organizations that can actually harm your own business.
Absolutely.
Good. Okay, still got a little time for questions, listeners. So please send them in before we wrap up. Let's kind of go around the table here the way we did when we started, and maybe each of you give a closing couple of thoughts here for takeaways for our listeners on this topic. So, Laura, why don't we go to you first for this one?
Well, I think you asked the question, Barry, about how do you get started and what organizations are doing what. The supply chain organization looks very different by how they're organized. We find that 50% of organizations, procurement reports through supply chain, 40% manufacturing reports through supply chain, 30% have source, make, deliver reporting through the same organization. And I find that when source, make, and deliver report to the same organization, then they tend to be more holistic about supplier development and procurement and the development of value chain, end-to-end, outside-in kind of processes. And when they do, risk management takes on a whole different flavor. When procurement is operating in a separate silo, we typically cannot move as fast. What I encourage companies to do is to take a day and to do a focused effort to look back at last year's performance and to look at what I call oops moments or misses, and to really step back and think about what drove those gaps in performance. And maybe it's inventory write-off, maybe it's recalls, maybe it's supplier failure, and to think more holistically around what those impacts are for the upcoming year and what it means to programs. What I often find is that people are so fast marching in the day-to-day that they don't really sit back and reflect and look at what they can see in their own data and their own experience. And I think it's reflective because often, what we see in small patterns can become large patterns in risk management. So that's one technique that's worked. The second technique that I think has worked is really looking at the balance sheet and closing the gap with finance about risk management, doing more work around network design, doing more work around what-if analysis, and helping to educate the finance group about how fragile the complex system of the supply chain is. I think many times people will see it as something that can be changed quickly, and many people don't understand the total risk. The third thing is, I think, employing the suppliers and supplier development programs to help mitigate risk. And for example, most companies don't know where their second and third tier suppliers are or their policies. And so the more that we can enlist suppliers to help us with risk mitigation strategies, the better off we are, because we need to know where those suppliers are, and we also need to understand the critical parts that are going into our materials. When the Japanese issues hit, Ford found that it was a third-tier supplier of bolts that shut down the production line, which they would never have predicted. When the issue hit, Intel and Seagate had corporate development teams on the ground to really work with suppliers, whereas others didn't and really felt the effects. So I hope that helps you, Barry.
It does. And actually, before we move along, a question came in for you, Laura. So why don't we give you that one, and then we'll go back to Rory and Brett for their closing thoughts. Question is regarding the network system. Are there suggestions as to what IT could look into?
Yeah, I think IT really needs to look into the building of value networks on canonical infrastructures. I think it's a major risk to our value networks that most of the value networks are based upon spreadsheets and Excel. And, passing of email, and even portals don't give us a persistent layer for really data sharing. So I think the more we can move into business-to-business data transactions and system of record. For example, I was talking to a supplier the other day to Caterpillar who says they get 32,000 spreadsheets a month for the manufacturing lines, and they never know what's real. As we build value networks, we can help suppliers to know what's really happening by investing in value network systems and being able to have a system of record there for the suppliers so that we have that synchronized information. It can't be tightly integrated because of differences in master data, but it can be synchronized and very effective. And the more we can work on hands-free processes, whether it's hands-free orders or hands-free procurement or matching for deductions. I was talking to a client yesterday that has 53% of the orders that are kicked out in the matching process of deductions, which is waste and it's risk. We've got about 18% of orders today that can come through hands-free. The more we can take the friction out of those processes and automate them so that they can flow, we reduce latency and we improve accuracy. I hope that helps.
Great. Okay, terrific. All right, let's kind of go back to our closing thoughts here and takeaways for our listeners. And Rory King, let's go to you first.
Okay, great. Actually, I can. It's great to hear all the experience and expertise Laura offered. I can actually build off of that. It's interesting. She talked about reviewing the oops moments, as she said. Interesting statistic. I mentioned earlier how we had surveyed the supply and demand chain executive readership last year and had over 500 folks participate in that study. 86% of them said they had what was, quote, a material disruption that impacted their financial or operating performance. So that's over 8 in 10 people. So that's just an interesting statistic to say that lots of folks had some of those pretty significant oops moments that had a material impact on their business. It's also worth noting, and there's obviously debate around, if this is real or perceived, but in those studies, and we've seen it increasing year over year, 64% said the frequency of risks has increased, and 69% said the financial consequences of those risks, those disruptions has also increased. So basically, I just think that speaks to the prevalence of risk and that they are real for most folks. And then, building off of that, I would say that there's more and more, and there's already some good research out there around the financial consequences of risk. Laura mentioned, and it's so true, to talk to the CFO and have them understand supply chain risk. A study done by Accenture said that the average share price reductions of companies that experience risk was 7%. And then there's some more detailed research. I can give you a few examples. 30 to 40% of organizations experiencing disruption have lower stock returns relative to their peers. Their share price volatility is 13.5% higher. They have 107% drop in operating income, a 10% increase in growth of cost, 7% lower sales growth, and they don't react quickly or recover quickly from disruption. And Laura mentioned a number of common disruptions that are familiar to folks in the supply chain, but on average, it takes organizations over 2 years at a lower performance of operating to recover from disruption. So anyhow, they're very real, and I think that there's a lot of statistics that can be used to paint that picture nicely. In terms of, I guess, from an IHS perspective, if I can offer this, Laura mentioned what if planning, scenario planning, and the fact that folks have supply chain networks and need to move those to more robust methods of mapping those things out. I'll just point out what I mentioned earlier, that I don't think people realize that there's also a prevalence of very high quality quantitative and qualitative information around, disturbances. I mentioned geopolitical disruption, war, terror, political unrest, all of the types of issues that are going to impact assets, operations, or suppliers. So I would just point out that those are available, and those are great to incorporate within supplier qualification. We see people asking for greater location information or the material, cost structure makeup of goods. So if I buy goods from a supplier, what's the relative percentage, or where are the underlying manufacturing, labor, commodity ingredients, or a recipe, if you will, of what goes into those goods. Folks are starting to ask for that information to link it up to get greater visibility, as Laura mentioned, to issues that may impact them globally in the supply chain. Thanks, Barry.
Okay, thanks, Rory. And Brett Armstrong, how about your closing thoughts, please?
Yeah, and I know we're short on time, but for me, if you're one of those fortunate businesses where you have a mature qualification program in place, I would consider thinking about more forward-thinking directions that you could take that qualification process above and beyond the traditional pre-qualification. Things I would suggest looking into is employee-level management. Again, not the employees of your organization, but those that are being employed by the contractors and suppliers that you hired. Do they have the appropriate training and credentials that you would expect of them before they come on site? Consider integrating time and attendance tracking with your badging and qualification programs that you already have in place. And then taking a deeper look into audit capabilities where it's appropriate. We find that there are multiple levels of risk within the supply chain. making sure that you're assessing risk based on the work that is being performed by those contractors and suppliers that you hire. And then, at the highest levels in terms of risk, considering doing a deeper audit into the actual business practices for those supply chain members. And then the last one would just be considering ways that you can provide the information that you have gathered to members of your team who may not be working in the office. If you have anyone who is working out on site, do you have a mobile strategy in place for being able to share this critical data with other members of your team?
Great. All right. Thank you, Brett. Okay, that times out just perfectly for us, so that's the time for today. I'd like to remind everyone that this web seminar, as well as part one of our risk management series and many other webinars, are archived at www.sdcexec.com. This one will appear 24 hours from now. And now I'd like to thank our panelists, Brett Armstrong of BROWZ, Rory King of IHS, and Laura Saucier of Supply Chain Insights. Also, a very big thank you to BROWZ for sponsoring this event. And thank you, all of you, for attending and participating and sending in some great questions. I'm Barry Hochfelder, editor of Supply and Demand Chain Executive, and this concludes our web conference. Goodbye.